much. Wanted to thank all my Facebook friends and family members for watching. Tonight happens to be Super Bowl Sunday, so instead of having church at the actual church building, because most people are going to be with their friends and their family and celebrating the Super Bowl with various parties and things, and just figured we'd give that time for them to be with their loved ones. And well, I still wanted to bring a message tonight, just in case for those that still wanted to watch it and have church, they could have church in their home. So I did have a message that I'm going to bring forth that I feel like God has spoken to me today. And before we get started, let's go ahead and say a prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for a day to be in your presence, and regardless of us being in your church building or not, we can have church anywhere. And I just pray a special blessing for those that are watching this video tonight on Facebook or on YouTube. And I just pray that it will be a blessing, and that they will, and we'll all be able to take something away from the words that you would have me to speak today. We just praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight I wanted to talk about, the title of my message is Don't Feed the Foxes. And this happens to be something that's very close to me in my walk with God. You know, I feel like throughout my time as being a Christian, God has spoken to me a lot about the small foxes in this life. And first, let me read this verse, and it'll show where we got this verse at. But it's the Song of Solomon, which is 2:15. And that verse states, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom." A lot of times, you know, in my own life, and I'm sure in the lives of many people, you know, we're confronted with temptations, or we're confronted with small things that seem to us on a grander scale to be more minuscule. Maybe not as big of a deal as the quote-unquote bigger sins or the bigger temptations out there, but nonetheless, we're confronted with these things and we're tempted to let those things slide. And I believe that in the Bible, that's what God's talking about by the small foxes, the things that we might not necessarily be as conscious of, but He's still trying to shed a light on that and say, hey, these are important, just like these bigger things are important, because they can throw you off course and throw your life off the track that God has planned for you just as much as the bigger things can. You know, I heard a story one time about an elderly lady. She had a white picket fence, a lovely picket fence, and the fence had just a magnificent ivy vine that was growing down the length of the fence. And one day, the neighbor's dog came over and tunneled underneath that fence and damaged the vine by his digging. And a few days later, an entire section of that vine had been withered. And it was all on the account of the one damaged spot that the dog happened to hit. So essentially, the entire vine ended up being spoiled and withering because of that one little spot that dog happened to damage. So by listening to the verse that we just read, and then also talking about the story of the dog and, you know, him tunneling underneath this fence, what can we learn from these illustrations? You know, you got to think of your life and your calling and purpose as being this beautiful ivy on the white picket fence. Then you got to think of the fox / the dog, which damaged a small portion of the ivy, as being the enemy and his attempts to make you fall. So what exactly are these foxes doing? They aren't necessarily looking to destroy your whole life in just one full swoop. In one big picture, they see it and they're just going to destroy it, and with one attempt. Basically, they're looking to damage just enough of a small portion so that it will cause the rest of your vine to essentially wither. And that might not be instantaneous. That might take a little bit of time, but the enemy of your soul knows what he's doing, and he's very patient. So if he can't throw you off course by just doing one big sin or one big temptation, he'll make sure that the small things that he does equals in the long run the same shipwreck to your faith. So my example to this, when I was sitting here writing this message, I was thinking about what happens when you set up 1,000 dominoes and you set them all up in a row. You took all this time to set up these dominoes, and you've got so many of them. But all you have to do is just push one domino out of 1,000 over, and the entire fruit of your labor collapses. It all just goes down in a matter of seconds by just pushing one domino out of 1,000. That is exactly Satan's plans for our lives as well. He wants to use small, sometimes seemingly meaningless distractions to throw your whole life off course. You think about the rate of divorce these days in the society in which we live in. How many marriages or ministries or lives have been completely shattered by something that once seemed so innocent? Just as a brief example, talking about married people in social media, there's all kinds of statistics out there, and I was reading up on some the other day online. There was an independent study done, and 2,000 people were polled, and out of 2,000 people, 1 in 7 people said that they had considered divorce because of their spouse's questionable behavior on Facebook, Skype, Snapchat, and Twitter. So all of these social media engines play a part in this, and 1 in 7 people had considered divorce from their spouse because of a misuse of these particular social norms that we're also accustomed to these days. Because a lot of times we reason in our heads, sure, friending your ex-girlfriend or boyfriend from freshman year of high school seemed like a harmless idea at the time. And just messaging them once seemed to be, just to be cordial and catch up, didn't seem like that bad of an idea. But countless messages and exchanging of phone numbers and secret encounters later, your life is completely turned upside down, and you find yourself embroiled in a broken home and a broken marriage, and kids that are upset because their parents aren't together anymore. And quite frankly, it all started with just the small foxes, the things that seemed so innocent and didn't seem like such a big deal at all. If you turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel 11, we're not going to read this entire story because it's quite long, but I'm going to go through just a brief description of this story, and you can read along on your own pace at a later time, so you kind of get the gist of what's going on. But in 2 Samuel 11, tells the story of King David and this woman named Bathsheba. And David, it states in here that in the very first verse of 11, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. A couple things to note here is that this specifically states that this is a time when kings go off to war. But David wasn't off to war. In fact, he sent his other men, his generals, and the rest of his army out to war while he stayed at home. Well, if we know anything else about this passage of Scripture, we know that David went up on his roof, and he walked around the roof of the palace, and he looked down, and he saw in a neighboring building a beautiful woman who happened to be bathing at that present time. I find that it's probably not so much a coincidence that David saw this woman bathing at that particular time, especially when he was home when he should have been at war. You see, David's curiosity got the best of him. Him walking on that roof at that time when kings
go off to war show that possibly David's roof encounter was more than just a chance. David had probably indulged himself in this view many times, but it's only when David's fantasies culminate does possibly the Bible go into detail on this story. So maybe David, and we're just speculating here because the Bible doesn't specifically say so, but for the sake of this conversation, I think it may be safe to say that David had seen that before. And David knew the times when Bathsheba went and typically took her bath and started bathing. So he knew what he was looking for. See, it was David's small fox of lust that led him from fantasy to reality by calling for another man's wife to lay with him, and this caused a chain reaction of bad events in the life of David and of the lives of people around him. Because if we read on more so in the story, we see that a lot of bad things happen. Once David called her up after he saw and admired her, he lay with her, and she was basically with child, with David's baby. But the problem was she was married to a man that was involved in the army of David and the army of Israel named Uriah the Hittite. So what happens is David tries to cover up his sin. He realizes that his lust had gotten the best of him and he was facing some consequences. So he had Uriah the Hittite placed on the front line by the commander because it was David's hope that Uriah would get killed in the line of battle, and then he would no longer have to be faced with the husband of this man's wife. So the woman that he laid with, he wouldn't have to basically fess up to his sin, and he could kind of dust it under the rug. So not only does the woman who is married become pregnant, and he has this man killed on the account of his own sin, the prophet Nathan came to him and said that this sin that happened to David, or that David brought on himself, will affect David's family line for generations to come, as the sword will never depart from your family. Not only that, David's baby that was to be born to Bathsheba was struck with an illness and died. So by the small lusts and the small temptations of David's adultery, a whole chain of events happened of negative consequences. Not only was David impacted, but his entire family paid the penalty, including this innocent little baby who ended up passing away because of David's sin. It's the small foxes. See, more than anything, we need to understand and be conscious of the small and somewhat harmless temptations, as they can be used to throw our whole lives off track. Is it fear that's maybe choking your passion and your hope for tomorrow? Is it an alcohol or drug use that you have under control, or so you think? Or is it the pornography that you feel like isn't hurting anyone and you're just doing it on your own time? See, foxes come in all different forms, custom bred by the enemy of your soul to fit exactly into your vineyard. Long enough to bite off a piece of your vine before running off to watch the damage that it creates. If we turn to the book of Judges in chapter 13, again, it's another long story that we don't necessarily have the time to get into, but I definitely encourage you to read this, in your own time. But Judges 13 tells us the story of Samson. See, Samson was a man pegged by God to be set apart and consecrated. But it was through a small fox, which was Samson's fleshly desires to pursue a woman outside of his own people, which displeased his parents to begin with. Samson was a man to be set apart, and he should have stayed within his own people to find a wife. But he did not do that. And to his parents' dismay, he ended up with Delilah, who was eventually Samson's downfall and led to him losing his calling, his eyesight, and for all intents and purposes, his very life. As we look at these examples, we see it's the small foxes, things that seem innocent enough, but eventually can lead to the downfall of an entire person's life direction. One thing I was thinking about, and it came to my mind as we were, or as I was writing this message up, sometimes I tell stories about, my experience in wrestling for my high school, Simon Kenton, because, a lot of things came from my experience as a wrestler. It built character in me and taught me a lot of lessons that I would, learn and continue to grow from in future dates to come. And I remember a particular match that I had. I was wrestling a kid at Holmes High School. And I remember this night because I had just gotten over the flu. And I was still sick. And it was my first day back to school. And I had been out for probably 3 or 4 days. But we just so happened to have a wrestling match that night. So I got to Holmes and I wasn't feeling 100%. And I ended up getting placed in not 1, but 2 matches for the night. And I was completely already exhausted before I even got out on the mat. But that's neither here nor there. That's just kind of the background of the scenario. But I was wrestling this kid, and I kept throwing an illegal move called a head trap. Basically, the head trap is where you just grab the guy's head without having an arm basically in the middle of your arms and his head, because per wrestling rules, you always have to have an arm to prevent like choking your opponent out and things of that nature. But I didn't have an arm. I just kept throwing it, and I would take him down by his neck, and I would throw him down to the ground. Well, obviously that seemed to be working for me because I kept using it. And the referee warned me. He said, if you throw that head trap one more time, I'm going to start taking points off of you. And I remember just kind of thinking, probably along the same lines of, big deal. A couple points, what's that going to do? So, to be honest with you, I still threw the head trap. And true to his word, the referee ended up reprimanding me again, and he took, 1 or 2 points away from my score. And again, 1 or 2 points doesn't seem like a big deal in the grander scheme of things. And, I'm sure I thought at that time that I was gonna take the kid down, and I would either beat him by points or I would pin him. Well, come to find out that when the smoke cleared and the match was over, there was no decisive winner because he didn't pin me and I didn't pin him. So when that happens, you have to go to the scoreboard and find out who had the most points in the match. And whoever had the most points, as in takedowns, would end up the match's winner. Well, as things would have it, there was a winner and there was a loser, and I just happened to come up on the losing end of the match, and it was only by about 1 or 2 points. Wouldn't that be something? Essentially, the thing that I thought was not going to have any bearing or any effect on the course of this match that I was in ended up being the deciding factor in having me lose the entire match because I chose to throw the head trap illegally. And for me, in that particular time, it was the small fox, the small temptation that ended up ruining my whole chances of winning that particular match. The gist of what we're talking about here tonight is just be conscious, be vigilant, be aware of the things around you and the schemes that the enemy may try to throw in your path to distract you or take you off of the course that God has for you. Because sometimes it's not always the big things. It's not always the things that you can see in bright blinking lights. It's the things that are just so easily sliding past us that can be the things that take us off where we need to be. that's basically all I had for tonight. That's going to be, our message. I just wanted to throw one out there on Super Bowl Sunday. So for anybody that was interested to see it, more than welcome to watch it. I appreciate everybody that came and watched this message, and I hope to see you all out at the church every Sunday at 6 p.m. Sunday night we have it 720 York Street. It is Ignite is the name of the service. We'll be back in full swing next week at the church. So I want to welcome every single one of the people that view this out for us, and thanks, and I'll be talking to y'all later.